Hello, everybody, and a very big welcome to this meeting of the Republican Labour Education Forum. In this session, we're considering do we need to cultivate a different culture for Englishness? And so we've invited Iqbal Hussain to talk about his the growing up he did in the north of England, because he's written a book, Northern Boy. And so we'd like him to come and tell us about his experience growing up in the north of England. So I'm going to go, but first of all, I'm going to go to Steve Freeman, to give an intro to the meeting. Over to you, Steve.
Yeah, thank you, Carol. And I just want to start by saying, and I'll be fairly brief, that we sometimes use the word Commonwealth of England as a term to represent the people of England, and we point to our democracy and our welfare, not of course the British Commonwealth, which is a term used for the legacy of the British Empire. But the Commonwealth of England has a past, and it has a present, and it has a future. And in the past, we've drawn attention, of course, to the first Commonwealth, the Republic of 1649, and it was a destruction of that first Commonwealth and the counter-revolution against it that led to the suppression of Ireland. It led to the expansion of the Atlantic slave trade and to the creation of the British Empire. So we've kind of lived through, how our history is shaped in that way. Now we also refer to a second Commonwealth of 1945, which produced the welfare state and the NHS, and which in a way marks the beginning, in a way, of the end, I suppose, of the British Empire. Remember in 1947, the creation of India and Pakistan, and of course, in many ways, a takeover of the UK by America, in a way, and the special relationship. Today, we're 80 years later. We're living, I think, in what might be called the smoking ruins of the social monarchy, that second version of the Commonwealth. As we know, it has been dismantled or destroyed by Thatcher and Blair, and after the financial crisis, which bankrupted the banks and cost taxpayers £850 billion. Now, since then, we've had austerity, we've had poverty affecting millions of people, the starvation of the public sector, and the destruction of public services. And we have today I would say, the absolute immorality of the Crown or the state supporting Israel's ethnic cleansing and genocide in Gaza and the West Bank. Yet, the idea of the people and the Commonwealth in England lives on, I would say, in the hearts and minds of those of us who want to see a better, more humane, more egalitarian, more democratic society. And so if we ask ourselves, what will the future Commonwealth of England look like? What will it be like? What will it feel like? How will the future of England be different from the past? Which is one of the reasons why we raise the slogan, Another England. But I think that we have to turn to the people and see how our culture is changing and must change for a better future. And therefore, we must turn to our artists, photographers, poets, musicians, and of course, our writers and our literature. And this is the context in which we've invited and welcomed Iqbal, author of Northern Boy, about growing up in a northern town, Blackburn. I think that's where we start. Let's see what our literature is telling us about life here in England and how we think it might change. So, with no more to do from me, Carol, back to you. Thank you.
I'm going to go straight to Iqbal. Iqbal, over to you.
Hi, hi all. It's really nice to be here, and I'll talk a little bit about my book, Northern Boy, which is da and that came out last June, and then we can talk about some of the issues that I've written about in the book. But the book itself is set in 1981 in Blackburn, Lancashire, and it's about a young boy in a working class Pakistani household growing up. And we first meet him at the age of 10, and then we meet him again at the age of 30, and then we meet him again at the age of 50. And it's a coming of age novel looking at various issues which we take in. So we look at things of sexuality, we look at family relationships, we look at racism, we look at the effect of Margaret Thatcher and all the mills and industry in the north shutting down, the effects that has on the community. But the overall message in the book, I think, is one of being true to yourself. And I called the book Northern Boy because I'm from the north, and that's how I always think of myself. So even though I've lived in London now for most of my life, in my head, I still think of myself as a Northern boy, and all my family is still there. I love everything about the north. I love the accent. I love the friendliness of the people. I love the architecture. I love the access to the beautiful countryside in the Lake District, the Pennines, all these beautiful parts of the world. Um, and I love how everyone, as far as I can tell, um, get on quite well. So despite your backgrounds, where you might have come from, it's a real melting pot. And that's not to say it hasn't had its problems, because it has had problems. It's had race riots. It's had all kinds of upheavals in the community. Back in the 70s and 80s, I think it was one of the first councils that had councillors who were from a National Front background. And now and again, every few years, something kicks off, and you have these awful riots again that happen. But largely, I think people get on, and I think people respect each other's views and each other's opinions, each other's religions, and you often see some to me, very sweet juxtapositions of women in hijabs, but they're having a lovely conversation with their next door neighbor who happens to be wearing a cap or whatever it is, a very English item of clothing. So I'm still hopeful that we see the good in everyone and that everyone largely gets on. But clearly, as in anywhere else in the country, there are issues. I don't live there, so I can't comment too deeply into what's going on. But I can talk about the things that I've read about, that my nieces and nephews and family talk about, and of course my upbringing. So I'm quite happy to take questions or to look at topics. So I'm not quite sure how your talks normally evolve, but that's the introduction. So that's me, and I've been writing full time for about 5 years, I would say, mainly short stories. And Northern Boy is my first novel. My first children's novel is coming out next year in January. And again, that's set in a working class Pakistani household. I just think it's important that I write about what I know. So much what I know about is that kind of background. And I've read many, many, many books which are written by English authors set in English houses, or any other culture. And while I love reading all of that, as a child, I very rarely read books that had other characters who had names like mine, who were brought up in a house like mine, who had that kind of poverty that we had, whose dad worked in the cotton mills. I saw very few books like that. So now, as an adult, given that I have that platform and that I can write, it's just naturally fallen into a pattern where I write about people who look like me, who have my kind of name, from my kind of family background. And in all of that, I look at big topics such as family, divorce, sexuality, I say racism, politics, because all of those things affect everyone, no matter what background you come from. But I just felt that for me, it would be very disingenuous for me to write a character who wasn't Pakistani. And also that's not my lived experience. My experience is as a member of an ethnic minority, growing up in the north of England. So I get the best of both worlds. I get the English side, I get the Pakistani side, and it's what I feel very comfortable writing about. And readers seem to like it as well. So yeah, I write about what I know. So that's me in a very quick nutshell.
I'm delighted to hear that you have had a very happy, it seems like you've had an extremely happy upbringing in the north of England, and you seem to have found many friends. So you didn't expect in your life, in your growing up life, you didn't experience any prejudice then. You
Oh
found,
no, I absolutely did. No, no, God no.
oh, you did, right?
Yeah, so even though I remember childhood as being largely very happy, there were always undercurrents of racism in the town, and there were riots. And um, the secondary school I went to, which I write about in Northern Boy, had a very 50-50 intake. So half the pupils were lower class Pakistani, half the pupils were lower class white, and the two didn't really get on. I'm afraid. So we had lots of racial encounters at school. At the end of school, skinheads used to gather at the school gates, and they would cause all kinds of problems. The police were often there. Oh no, those secondary school years in particular, I encountered a lot of racism. Primary school, interestingly, no. So my primary school was a Church of England school. The intake was 95% lower class Pakistani, 5% lower class white, and yet, um, despite it being a Christian school, we would all sing hymns, we would all do the prayers, and as long as we were told by our parents that we didn't accept that Jesus was the Son of God, but he was a prophet of God, everything else went. And we observed Christmas, we observed Easter, we observed all the festivals that you would expect in a Christian school. We had no problem with it. We had the parables, we had readings from the Bible, and all those things made me and the kids who went there into who we were. So we got a brilliant education, very rigorous. We got taught grammar. We taught how to write with a fountain pen. We were almost taught more than we needed to, just because we came from such a poor background.
Mm.
I think we needed more to equip us in the real world. I started school not speaking a word of English, as did most of my peers. So we learned very quickly at school how to speak English, how to read, how to write. We had very little help at home from our parents for homework, because they were the first generation who had come over in the 60s to work in the cotton mills. So their English skills were not particularly good. They just got on with what they had to get on with, and they learned as much English as they needed to. So my generation, that second generation, learned very quickly, and we learned that we had to assimilate, that we had to be better than the people around us. So all those very migrant, immigrant, working class messages that you hear about were definitely true for us. But no, that spectre of racism and unease was always present. Even if it was seeing the sign of NF scrawled on a wall, the National Front logo. So even if you might not encounter a skinhead in your community, you were aware of them, or people would talk about the football fans coming in, as we have Blackburn Rovers, this massive team. So you're always aware of the undercurrent, and you were always aware of local news covering marches and demonstrations. But yet, despite all of that, the community we lived in, which was 50-50 mixed of white and Pakistani, that community got on very well. So that was a mixture of elderly people, young people, families, Asian and English. So I never encountered any hostility in the immediate neighborhood. At secondary school, yes, but that was in a different neighborhood. But growing up, no, it was a really happy time as a kid. And really only at the age of about 11 was I aware that actually things are not always as nice as this.
Well, that's marvelous to know that the Church of England was running a really great school there. That's
Brilliant.
really good to know. And of course, children learn racism, don't they? I mean,
Mm.
the younger you are, then the kiddies don't see the difference. So the Church of England school obviously nurtured that. That's marvelous to hear that. But high school wasn't so good, unfortunately.
So,
Yeah, that's when children start to learn from their parents, isn't it? And
yes, and at high school, you would encounter racism on an almost daily basis. And often it would be low level racism. It'd be a name call in the queue, or somebody pushing you or shoving you, or somebody making some comment about curry or smell or something like that, just very low level. And the higher level was when you had these much older boys who would gather at the school gates, clearly skinheads, clearly had a problem, clearly were not afraid of using violence. So then you had to find ways of getting home that avoided where they were gathering. And you would have police protection for some of the way. And these are not experiences that you would expect to have in this country. I didn't expect to have it. And I don't think it's fair that any child should have to experience that. I think secondary school is hard enough. Being a teenager is hard enough with hormones and everything else, without this real fear of people who want to do you harm for no other reason than you're not white. So that was a really scary time. And I always say that I survived despite secondary school, but I think primary school gave us such a good grounding that carried us through into the college and university years. But the secondary school years were not good. But now, when I go onto a Facebook page that's set up for that school, and the school itself has been knocked down, so it's knocked down a few years after I left. Good riddance, quite frankly. But the memories of people, including other Asian people who comment on that board, are overwhelmingly positive. And I think that wasn't my experience. So maybe sometimes we like to remember the past in a more positive sense, and maybe on a public forum, people want to just highlight all the positive things. And some things were positive. I learned how to type, and that's my old typewriter from school. So that skill I've never lost. It's always paid my way. And as a journalist, and as a writer, I type all the time. So some things were brilliant. The teachers were brilliant, most of them. But there wasn't much. We weren't pushed particularly because half the population of that school was Pakistani, half was white. We were all lower working class. We weren't really pushed hard in our academic studies, so you had to find real reserves of strength to fight against it and to do your homework and to research yourself. So yeah, it was a very strange time, secondary school, and I would never want to go through it again. But it definitely made me, in the way that primary school made me. It just showed me that life wasn't all ha ha he he. In the words of Mira Sayal's book, that there were difficulties for no other logical reason other than you didn't look like somebody else.
Exactly, and that's part of the meeting. The reason for the meeting today is, I mean, you would obviously, I hope you regard yourself as English now, and of course we would obviously welcome you and regard you as English. But as you said, those people at the school gates were not doing that. They were targeting you because of the color of your skin, and that's what we want to talk about. And that's one of the reasons for this meeting. We want to emphasize the fact that being English is so much more different today. It's not white Anglo-Saxon. We have so many wonderful, vibrant cultures in England now, and so we should be thinking about a completely different mindset about what English means. Anyway, enough from me. Please, if anybody would like to jump in here, please do put your hands up, ask Iqbal questions, and please, if you use your electronic hand, that's easier for me to see. So can I please bring someone who would like to ask Iqbal a question or discuss this whole question of Englishness on the topic? No,
I would like to talk, but I don't know.
Oh, excellent. Right, I'll bring you in, David.
Right, thanks. I'll introduce myself first. Will I start? It's okay.
Hi, David.
I'm Davy Marzella. It's the first meeting I've been along to. I mean, I've met Steve previously, some time ago, round about the Scottish independence referendum through the late Alan Armstrong. But I'm really fascinated. There's so much I could say about this. I'm Scottish, but I live in London. But the first question I'd like to ask Iqbal, do you make any distinction between identifying as English or British?
Well, that's a really good question. English and British. I don't. If somebody asks me what I am or on a form, I nearly always say I'm British, and I'm absolutely fine with that because I think it covers everything. I think that I am more than just England. I'm the whole of these four countries, and I'm very happy to call myself British Pakistani. I like that hyphenation because that's both of my cultures together. I always say that I am of Pakistani heritage. so that's my background, and I'm very proud of that. I always say I'm Northern, really proud of my roots. And I also say that I'm a Londoner because I've been here for more years than I've not been. But I never say that I'm English, interestingly. I always say that I'm British.
Yeah, I mean, it's a big question, and I'm sure we can talk about it more. But certainly, from what I know of Steve's background, and probably the whole concept of this group is to focus on another England, and because in the left in general identify as British. They don't want to be identified as English. English is no, we're not English, we're British. English is nationalistic, it's chauvinistic, it's arrogant, and it's really so difficult to get through to so many people on the left to accept that they are English. That there's a geographic place called England, that where we're living is called England, and there's all obviously Scotland and Wales, and so many English people will talk about England and Britain interchangeably without even recognising they're making a distinction. But there's lot. I don't want to go on too much. It's a few. I'm sure other people have stuff to say, but I'll come back later.
Thanks, David.
Okay.
I would just add that for me, English or England, it's become a bit tainted because often I think of some nationalistic flag waving English flag, because often that's the symbol that I've seen a lot. That's not been a positive symbol. And the connotation for me for English or England is often not as positive as British, even though that's also been used negatively. British National Party. Yeah, there's something parochial about English. It's very small, even though it's not small. It's a huge country, and of course we're in England, and of course we're English. But that's never the first thing I think of when I think of myself. It's always British.
Yeah.
That's very, very interesting. Thanks for that question, David.
Good question.
I'm going to bring Mike Hope in now. Mike?
Yeah, I mean, your question, David, and your answer, Iqbal, were really, really important, I think, because it's very, very important that we are able to sort of reclaim, I suppose, the radical tradition of England, which is, of course, buried in history, because history is written, as we know, by the victors. Quite interesting when the film of Peterloo came out two or 3 years ago, the Peterloo Massacre of 1819, where the troops were turned on a bunch of mainly working class people, a huge number of working class people who'd gathered to hear a popular speaker on democracy. And this was something the ruling class really didn't want at the time. But yeah, so there is this other whole England. You do not have to. We want to make it plain that you do not have to wrap yourself, Mr. Starmer, Sir Starmer. There we are. You take the you take the gongs from the crown, you become a Sir or an MBE or whatever. But Sir Keir Starmer, you wrap yourself in the Union Jack as some means of trying to sort of gain credibility. There is a whole other way to be English, and that is what we want to kind of re-establish. But yeah, I just wanted to say a couple of things. First of all, there is a danger, I think, of othering the north of England. It happens quite a lot. Well, that's where, everybody is so much poorer. They are somehow behind us in the south. And, they still live in back-to-backs and all these nonsense ideas. And of course, it's so much more civilized in the south. I can remember I moved, I lived in London for about 13 years in the 80s and the 90s. No, sorry, the 70s and the 80s. And I I can remember being on a bus in Woolwich in southeast London with my then girlfriend who was black. And a bunch of racist thugs got on, and we had to get off that bus pretty damn quick because they were going for us. And those things happened in London. I was part of a group, well, we called it Workers' Defence, whatever it was, but we tried to sort of offer a degree of protection for um, then quite not so numerous black and Asian tenants on housing estates, and the attempt by the National Front to take over Brick Lane. We had set twos with them. Luckily, when confronted with anything like equal force, the master race just ran for it. They're not they were cowards beyond belief. But just finally, I just want to mention a couple of writers because you're a writer, Iqbal, and I think the role of writers is really important. Somebody I've just written an invitation to come and talk to us is the poet Lem Sisay, who was brought up not so far from you, I think, in sort of Wigan area between Liverpool and Manchester, and of course he was just totally abused by the state, the crown, insofar as he was taken into care because his parents weren't married, and he was not allowed to know his real identity until he forced it out of social services when he was an adult. He was named Norman. He didn't know what he was. He didn't even know that he was half Ethiopian. And yet Lem has gone on to become incredibly successful. Very far. I saw him a handful of weeks ago. He's highly entertaining, but very sharp. There is a sharpness there. There is an edge to his experience. There's real pain. If you read his autobiography, My Name is Why, it is really painful. And that is what the Crown did to a lot of children without the legitimate parent, without married parents who were poor, but particularly if they had different colour skins. And very briefly, the other author I want to mention, who did conjure up a very strong sense of the Northern identity, was a guy called Gordon Byrne, who wrote, amongst other books, a novel called The North of England Home Service. He was living in the Northeast, so that was his part of Northern England. But he conjured up a very particular atmosphere, and he was not afraid to explore the dark corners. He wrote a non-fiction book about the lives of the people affected by the Yorkshire Ripper. But and then he died really quite young and quite tragically. But I think he's a really important writer, actually. Anyway, thanks.
Thanks very much, Mike.
Thanks, Mike.
Steve has his hand up. Would you like to come back? Would you like to come back, Iqbal, to anything that Mike has said?
Yeah, I was going to say that Lem Sisay, first of all, really good writer, really good poet. I've met him, I've heard him speak, and you're quite right, Mike. He has an edge to it all. So as nice as he is, that's definitely an edge, and I think that's clearly and understandably born out of being treated very badly by the system for many, many years. And as you know, as you say, he was rechristened Norman because his social worker was called Norman, treated really badly. But he now writes about his experiences of being in care and foster care and his search for his identity. And you're right, you can get bad treatment anywhere, and we mustn't make the North something different. For me, it's just because that's where I'm from. That's what I know. So I can't write about or talk about Northumberland or Essex or anywhere else. All I know is the North, and I know London. So that they're my experiences. But you're right, the badness or goodness or whatever it is can happen throughout the whole country. Interestingly, as children growing up, when we used to talk about white neighbours, we used to call them English rather than white, which is interesting. I just realised that we always used to say, "Oh, the Englishman in door 44, he wants something." So back then, I must have, we all must have been in that community, must have been using the term English. Now it's just, no, it's just never crossed my mind. And I think to some degree, I feel that we need to just rebrand, that we need a really good marketing exercise just to reclaim Englishness, because it still just seems to me, on a very subconscious level, it's like England for the English. That's what I think whenever I hear the term. And people often use that term to cause mischief. So I think Suella Braverman, I feel, did that recently when she said that Rishi Sunak could never be English. There's just something, it's been claimed by the right at the minute, and I feel that we need to claim it back. For me to ever think that I would call myself English, not that I think English in general is a bad term, but there's definitely a subconscious moving for me avoidance of it, because I just think of those images of England for the English and the flag and the football hooligans wearing it around themselves more than the Union Jack, I feel. It used to be the other way around growing up, but I think it switched somewhere along the way, and the England flag and the England terminology became more charged. But yeah, so you're absolutely right. But the thing about the North and regionalism is that because we live in a country where we often hear from writers and artists and poets who are often from the South, again, there's nothing wrong with that. But if that's the only kind of literary image you're getting or the message you're getting, it makes it even more important that those of us who are from a regional background write about those regions. That's not to say that we have to whitewash those regions and pretend that everything was hunky-dory, because I certainly don't do that in my book either. It's the warts and all thing. But I think we do need to see books that are set in Manchester, set in Leeds, set in Lancashire, and also books that are not pandering to the old stereotypes of people with whippets and the Northerners are always friendly, or they're always poor, or they wear clogs, or they eat hot pot, or whatever it is. I'm sure lots of those things still do happen, and of course I remember those things growing up quite strongly. But there's much more to regions than we see in books and the press. And yeah, we are still probably outnumbered enormously, regional writers or writers who are not Londoners or Southerners, or who haven't gone to posh schools, or who haven't got connections. And that's why it's really important that we see books that have a regional bias in some way, whether that's a setting or the character or the character's names, or some bit of the story that's dealing with a background that happened up north. And we are seeing that more and more. And people up and down the country really like seeing books and films that are not always set down south. So I think it's really healthy. And as long as you say, Mike, that we don't make it all very stereotypical. And that's what hopefully I've avoided in my book, because even the Asian family I write about is not, that's my family I write about, albeit in fictional form. And I know that our family was nothing like Mr. Patel down the road, or Mrs. Darwood in 2 Streets Up. So even though you can all be Asian, you can all be Pakistani, you can all be Northern, you can all be Lancastrians, you're still unique, and your story is still going to be different from your neighbours. But yeah, really good points. Thank you.
That was, I loved your phrase you just said there, reclaim Englishness. I think that's a really lovely phrase to use. I'm going to bring in Steve again now.
Yes, thank you. First of all, it's a question, and then I just want to make a comment. The question really was, I feel, and I want you to correct me if I think wrong, that there has been over our lifetime, in the 50s, 60s, 70s, when you've outlined what it was like to live in a northern town of Blackburn during the 70s and 80s and grow up there, and the racism, and we remember the National Front, all the rest of it. I think there's been a decline of racism over this period, but there's a qualification to this. Is I actually fear or think that we are seeing a rise of racism in the political period in which we are living. I mean, the rise of reform, for one thing, what Trump is doing in America, and all these things across Europe with the AfD. So the crisis that we're doing is that even though we might feel that the country's become more integrated in some ways, and maybe that's wrong, by the way, but I mean, that's just my feeling. You might correct me if you think that's wrong, but as if we have combated racism to a certain extent, but that is all about to go up in flames again, if you know what I mean. In other words, we have a problem to how we're going to unite and fight a growth of racism as a result of the crisis which the country is facing, which I call the smoking ruins of our social post-war settlement, our social monarchy. So that was my first comment. So the question really is, do you think racism is growing again? Do you think it did decline? How? So that's the question. The comment, I think, is to go back and to emphasize, and something that David said. David, hi David, it's good to see you, by the way. And what I think over my lifetime, when all the evidence says that when people came from abroad to this country, being British was a way in which, because of the empire, you could feel part of this society. It wasn't an alien concept because people felt Britishness was sort of a globalist sort of thing, and it encompassed many countries, the West Indies and India, Pakistan, etc. You could feel part of it. Whereas English was a kind of alien thing, equivalent. And I think a white idea, it's Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, white. That's what Englishness means. And in a certain sense, Englishness was kind of frozen under this Britishness. It would never really change. It just sort of hung around and it wasn't there. Now, this refers back to David, it's the rise in some part of Welsh nationalism and Scottish nationalism and the struggle in Ireland that's made people in England think, well, who are we? What is the English question? Who are the English? You know what I mean? That's something that's posed. But I also noticed that second generation immigrants, if they're not immigrants, it's second generation, but you know what I mean, people who've come from other countries or background other countries have started now much more to call themselves English. So there is a kind of growing Englishness, and I think the phrase, we need to rebrand, we need to redefine what England is in a way that is a multicultural way, in a way that is a multi-religious way, in a way that everybody feels, as it were, comfortable with. Because I think if you're not white, then the word English sounds a bit alien. It sounds like it is white, and you can never be part of it. And that's what Suella Braverman was getting at when she said, Richie Sunak, you cannot be English because basically you're brown or black, and you can only be British. You cannot be English, and that is something we have to challenge, and we're being forced to it. As David's point about Scotland. Redeveloping a modern Scotland, a modern idea of Scotland, you know what I mean? And we have to have a kind of modern idea of England, and that's why, for me, that's why I think your book, is contributing to what we need to be thinking about. I mean, that's what I would say.
Thanks, Steve. No, a really good point, and I think you're right. I think the problem is when we say, "What do we mean by English? Are you English?" I think there's an undercurrent behind it. And Suella Braverman definitely demonstrated it. I think she's defining English to be white, so white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. That's what she's meaning, and I don't know where that comes from, but that's what she thinks. Rishi Sunak obviously thinks he's English. I think he's English. I'm English. We don't hold that same definition, but I do think that the right, when they say, "Are you English?" what they really mean is, are you by race white? Excuse me. So that there's an unsaid question in it, which is definitely about your color of your skin and your ethnic heritage, which just seems such a strange question, given we've had immigration to this country for many, many decades now. As I say, my parents came over in the 60s. Before them, there would have been a generation that would have been there as well. This nonsense about this English idyll where everyone's a Morris dancer and they all live around a village green and every village is white and that's all your neighbors and you all tootle around in these perfect cars. Ridiculous. We haven't been like that for many, many, many years. And I can't say that anyone would say that we've lost anything because of that. I think we've gained in the way that language is gained by getting words from other languages. English has definitely benefited from having beautiful words put into the language, which makes modern English so versatile, especially compared to languages like French and Spanish that don't inherit words as much. And I think in the way that English language spoken here is so inclusive, I think the English people are so inclusive, and Rishi Sunak has every right to say that he's English. I think he is English. But of course he's not white. But to me, the whiteness is not what defines English. To me, English is whether you're born and bred here, or at the very least, that you uphold the values of the country, and again, that's an interesting point. Again, what do we mean by values? What these values? Often they are touted by the right, and these nebulous values as to what allegedly the non-white people are not exhibiting. But if you support your country, you're loyal to your country, your values are those of the wider populace, and if you see yourself as a member of that community, like, I don't think that, even though I'm Pakistani, that's my heritage. In terms of all my beliefs and things, they're of this country. This is where I'm born. This is how I think. This is how I speak. This is all the politics and everything about the Englishness is in me. In my house, I have furniture that's arts and crafts furniture, this very English style of furniture that William Morris was making. In some ways, you couldn't get more English. It's just absurd that she can decree that somebody else, because they're brown, is English. But that says everything about Suella Braverman, sadly. And the question about, do I think racism is growing? Do you know what? If you'd asked me that a few years ago, I would have said no. I think we're making real good progress, and it's a much happier country, and how brilliant we all are, and how we are a real melting pot. Obviously, we have little issues here and there, but I would have said no, we get on very well. And then we had the riots. Was it last year or the year before? I can't remember now. But in my book, in Northern Boy, there's a scene in 1981 where skinheads invade their neighborhood and the young boy's terrified. And that was bringing back things that I remembered from childhood. And when I wrote that bit in the book, I thought, thank God that's never going to happen again. And utterly shocked and disgusted and scared and frightened when a year ago, 2 years ago, it all kicked off again. And so that did unsettle me. And at that point, I did think, have we actually got better? Or did we just get better at covering it up? Did people still hold on to their racist views, but they were less inclined to share them because it wasn't more acceptable for them to be overtly racist? Then when we had these riots, and they spread very fast on social media, and I think social media has a big part to play in this, because it makes everyone very accessible. They can gather opinions, they can gather bodies very quickly. Things can spread like wildfire, including wrong messages. And keyboard warriors, you can be anonymous in the hatred that you put online. Suddenly 2 years ago, we had these awful riots again, and that was a real shock to my system. I never ever thought we would ever go and see that again. I thought, I've done that once, it was a horrible time, but we are better than that. The country is much nicer. In general, it's a nicer country. In general, we're a more thoughtful country. And that made me sit up a little bit. But do you know what? Even then, I think that's not the bulk of the country. I think that's a small part of the country who thinks like that and who got emboldened and who were doing dreadful things and who were setting fire to hotels and who were intimidating people of non-color. But we then still saw these lovely images and heartwarming images of communities, white, black, brown, Chinese, all coming together, clearing up the broken glass, helping their neighbors, making cups of tea, saying that this is not in our name. And you know what? That heartened me. I think that's who we are. I think that's who the English are. That, to me, in a nutshell, they're the people who welcomed my mum and dad when they didn't speak a word of English back in the 60s, who would have taken cups of tea around there, who would have tried to speak to my mum. That's that's who we are. That's who the English are. And I think but it's very easy to now give a lot of coverage to the vocal minority. And I'm not saying that they don't have their grievances. They clearly do that. Otherwise, why are they acting up? But I refuse to believe that that's the England that we have not become. I still think that's a minority, and I still think we, in general, have got better. But we must never get complacent, as those events showed us, that there are still undercurrents. And the rise of the far right in politics, absolutely, that's a scary thing. We never thought that would happen. So we can never get complacent. It's very easy for them to mobilize. They're very good at doing PR. They're very good at marketing. They're very good at tapping into angry people, especially angry young men. And they know how to spin a story. And maybe that's something that the left and the liberal parties can all learn something from. Just how do you tap into your audience? How do you get your message across? But yeah, generally, I think we are better. But yeah, we are certainly not as well adjusted as I thought we were.
Thank you very much, Iqbal. Very well answered. I'm going to bring Phil in first because he hasn't spoken yet, and then Mike. Phil.
My interest is always relationship between this country and empire. And I think that the interesting thing is the 50s. We got along okay because we spun ourselves a story that basically we'd done a lot of good for the world and that everyone thought we were rather marvelous. Then these unfortunate events like countries wanting their independence started occurring, which we took various approaches to in Kenya very brutally, in other places less brutally. We had the experience of Uganda, and we were made to confront the heritage when Idi Amin took power, and somehow this country was seen as a place where everyone from empire had a place, as Steve pointed out. And I remember very well the period in London when the Lewisham riots happened, and I was nearly thrown out of a train by National Front people who thought I was, well, quite rightly, that I was an anti-fascist. But fortunately, one of them decided it wasn't a good idea. But what I'm trying to say is that I believe this stuff is always there. I think the economy makes quite a difference. Now, in the 50s, things were going pretty well. We had a boom going on after the war, but we didn't have enough labor. We had to bring people in to service the economy for jobs that people didn't want to do. And that was really what enabled us to set up a reserve pool of racism, where you had this kind of group of people from different countries, Caribbeans, yourself, your heritage, Southeast Asians, and they provided the pool of racism which we needed, which the ruling class always needed to be able to use in times of if things got a bit difficult, which of course they did at certain points, which we will all remember, particularly in the 80s and the last part of the 70s. Well, there were all sorts of periods. The 60s, although they're seen as a boom period, were not, in fact. There were many years where things were incredibly difficult. And wherever unemployment happened, then it could be blamed on this reserve pool of racism. What's very interesting, of course, is how racist the trade unions were. If you look at the number of unions that refused to allow Asian heritage or Afro-Caribbeans to join their unions, there is a plaque in Euston Station which actually commemorates the first member of the Railway Workers Union, who was an Afro-Caribbean. It shows you there was real resistance. They didn't want them there, but Jack Dash, the Dockers, etc., they didn't want any non-white members at all. It was a very strong racist thing. Then there's the story of apartheid, of course, how that was supported. So I think I never believe this goes away entirely, I'm afraid, Iqbal. I think even though I absolutely agree with you what your analysis is. I think there's always going to be this. It's like the Germans have the term Gastarbeiter, these Turkish guests. They're guest workers. And I don't know, somebody told me once, an ex-girlfriend of mine told me that her family always had a suitcase packed because we were never sure when things were really tough with the National Front. They were never sure where they might have to go, So that these stories sort of now, yes, I agree, Steve, maybe things have diminished. But if you look at our media, how much of it is white? How many of the people who populate our newsrooms are white? If you look at David Harewood's excellent documentary, Will There Ever Be a Black Prime Minister? He looks down from above at the BBC newsroom of 400, and there's only 3 black people in there, and 2 of them are just doing photocopying. So it shows you that it's hierarchically incredibly white. Look at the MPs. Yes, there are some improvements there. But then, of course, race doesn't necessarily guarantee politics, does it? Look at David Lammy. So it's that whole problem. Look at Suella Braverman. Look at the black Tories. I mean, Suella Braverman had the cheek, and of course, Priti Patel to stand up and say, "I can't be racist. I'm Pakistani." She actually said that. I've been racially abused. So, I suppose my point is that, and I'm going to enjoy getting hold of your book, and I'm very glad that you've come and talked about it. But I wonder, particularly as someone who spent far too long in the South, whether things do you feel they are really changed in the North, or do you feel, partially the riots that we had, that the whole thing could just erupt again? I mean, I'm not so sure it can't.
I think you're right, Phil. I don't think it'll ever go away, and I think flashpoints happen, and it comes to the surface again. So, yeah, I'm not in any way deluded into thinking that it's ever going to go away, or that it has gone away. No, and I do think to some degree it was not covered up. That sounds like somebody's doing it on purpose, but I think it became less acceptable for people to voice those kinds of views. And then a couple of years ago, when the riots happened, they became emboldened again, and they were under. They felt completely confident in saying their horrible things and doing their horrible things. And I think you're always going to have that element, sadly, because if that's what your parents believe, and the parents teach the children, and the children will teach their children, I don't know at what stage that kind of thinking ever gets broken. So it's always going to be there to some degree. But because I'm an optimist, I'd like to think that things are getting a bit better. But those riots did shock me. I was absolutely shocked. And suddenly those old feelings of feeling quite afraid if you're going out. You didn't know if somebody was going to shout something to you from the car, or lob something at you, or spit on you. These are things I've not felt since I was a child, a teenager. So, yeah, it's funny how things that I had thought I'd abandoned came back out again, and the feelings came back out again. And it felt very unsafe in the country again. And at that point, I certainly wasn't thinking, oh, it's only a small number of people who feel like this. I felt quite vulnerable, as did my family, as did my friends. So, yeah, it's never going to go away. Whether it's got genuinely better, or whether I want to believe it's got better, are different things, really. As I say, I'm an optimist, so I would like to believe that people are generally nicer. But as we saw, these things are rarely far from the surface. And whether things have improved. The North is interesting because I'm not there enough. I don't feel that I'm qualified enough to say. But we hear of flashpoints again that happen in the North, stories that then travel to the main press. And I think there are always going to be incidents. I mean, Blackburn, where I come from, it has always had difficult relationships between the white people and the black and the Asian people. And again, I don't think that's ever going to go away. I think it's largely in many ways, people live quite separate lives there from what I see. Other ways they come together, and that's really lovely to see. And there's events and there's library things and there's groups and mosques open their door and churches similarly open their doors. So there's definitely an attempt to get communities to mix. How far the mixing can go, I don't know, because ultimately people, I think, still feel very comfortable in their own flock. But I can't really say up north. I mean, it feels better whenever I'm up there. So as an adult, whenever I've been back up north, it feels better. But also, I'm not mixing in circles where I might come across horrible views, and I'm not going into neighborhoods that feel dangerous. Like my school was in a neighborhood that was quite a very white neighborhood, a very poor working class white neighborhood. So I don't have to do that as an adult. So I don't have to go into those neighborhoods anymore. I know where they are, but I probably wouldn't want to just walk around there on my own. So that's quite telling. So clearly, on that level, whether it's real or imagined, I still don't feel that I would ever want to walk around that area on my own. Almost no matter whether it was in the daytime or in the evening. And we still get stories that describe flashpoints as, say, little riots that happen or some incident that's between white youths and Pakistani youths or vice versa. But yeah, because I don't live there, I couldn't say categorically if I think it's better or not. It feels better, but that could just be me as an adult wanting it to feel better.
Thank you very much, Iqbal. I'm going to bring Mike in now again. Mike.
Yeah, just on the whole question of did racism sort of diminish only to start to rear its extremely ugly head again recently? I tend to agree with Phil, and I think what did happen is that the state, the crown, took greater and greater control, more and more legislation to do with immigration controls, which always had text about patriality. Now, that was a way of saying people with a different color skin without actually saying it. And then about who has rights to come here, who has rights to claim benefit. And, now it's really, the whole thing is pretty much sewn up. So, insofar as that is accepted by the majority of the population, there is an internalized racism which becomes the norm. And yeah, I think just on that, the Phil mentioned, there was a need in the post-war period for labor, so people from other countries of the old empire were brought in. Well, now there's a need for labor, but are migrants being allowed to work? No, they're not. And those people who are brought in under very strict conditions. Either they got to be stinking rich, in which case, no problem. It's a bit like, Elon Musk and the tech brothers arguing with the MAGA Trumpites that they want, rich tech people to come into the States, but nobody else. There is much the same, the qualification about wealth. You really got to be pretty wealthy to be able to come in. And then, to sort of become naturalized, again, you've got to hand over a whole load more money. It totally disqualifies most working class people from doing that. So the whole thing has become normalized in that sense as well. I think Iqbal, just moving to a slightly different point. Iqbal, you questioned, you know, you said, oh, the idyll of I suppose like the one conjured up by John Major of sort of, ladies warm beer and ladies peddling to church and village greens and all that crap. That existed must be a long time ago. Iqbal, it never existed. It was always an illusion. It was always a chocolate box, which was conjured up again. History is written by the victors. And it's an image which they have wanted to perpetuate, and it ain't true. It really, because, way back then, it was the Irish, and it was, people, but, and white working class people generally suffered. People were, Thomas Hardy writes about it. People were forced to leave the countryside to go to the towns to work, and they were immiserated, whether they worked in worse and worse conditions in the country, or if they became part of the new urban working class. And Engels and Marx wrote about that, again looking at the whole Greater Manchester area. They didn't call it Greater Manchester. Just a final point, though, which is there's another whole perspective on Englishness of people arriving in this country, which is, and many of them, or some of them, are white, whereas previously it was people who were from the ex-empire, who came in. More recently, there have been people from Eastern Europe and from elsewhere. Now, somebody very dear to me arrived about 10, 11 years ago from a small country in Eastern Europe. And she still refers to, when we talk about your country this and your country that, she has experienced extreme discrimination. She might look white and all the rest of it, but she's experienced all of that. She also, the whole Brexit experience, that really traumatized a lot of those people. And I think, we haven't really touched upon Brexit, but that, to me, was the sign, a big sign that things were really not right. And it certainly has had an effect on many, many people who will never, went to schools where they were taught that, streets of Britain were paved with gold and it was the mother country and all of this stuff. But, they are nonetheless as English now as we are. And it is our task to create a sense of Englishness which is embracing and comprehensive rather than exclusive.
Absolutely. Perfectly said.
Yes, Mike, thank you very much. Phil, I see you still have your hand up. Did you want to come in again?
Yes, if I may. I think one of the problems we have, Iqbal, is well, Mike mentioned the immigration controls. One of the major ones was the 1948 Act, I think it was, which actually defined that they didn't want, quotes, dark people, or words to that effect, from the empire. It was an act designed to control who came in on the basis of colour. Now, it was a Labour Party thing, 1948. And I think one of the great problems we've had is that we haven't had a well-articulated anti-racist position in either, well, certainly not in the Labour Party. I wouldn't expect it so much in the Tory Party, although there were good liberal Tories who opposed racism. And this has led to the fact that we can have a government that now has normalised hating on migrants, carrying on the Tory hating on migrants. I mean, I don't hear any difference between Cooper or Braverman, really, if you're talking about the nuts and bolts of what they want to achieve. It's not about actually doing anything more than holding, scapegoating those who they think they can scapegoat, whilst skating over the fact that our economy is shrinking. And, you know, the country has had a 4% hit in GDP since Brexit. And it's no good trying to pretend that that's the fault of immigrants. But the point is, people will come here. And one of the reasons they will come here is because they have connections, but also it's the English language. So I always like to say this to people who come out with these racist comments. So I said, well, it's your fault. If you hadn't gone around the world teaching people English and making them learn English, you wouldn't have this problem. And then having your world service beaming out everywhere and American, well, unfortunately, Trump shut down the Voice of America, so there'll be less English going around the world now. That's one of the things I'm really supporting Trump on. I think they should certainly shut it down while he's there. But no, seriously, I mean, this is a cultural thing where we have had a predominantly white cultural view of what Englishness is, and it's our job to challenge the Labour Party's racism, to challenge the construct of the Crown's notion of what democracy is. And we're not going to make progress if we can't revivify our democracy, and because the current one isn't working. And you can't have a country where you claim it's multicultural if you've got a white king and his white children on a hereditary principle as head of state. It's just not going to work. It puts out the message, especially as they own so much of the countryside anyway, and they get by without being taxed whilst everyone else is. It's clearly a country riven by privilege, which I, having lived since the 1950s, can remember. You know, I can remember all this stuff. It's got, you know, the pageantry and all that, and the coronations, and, you know, the white people going in, and Lady Diana with her white relatives and all that stuff. We are a long, long way from making that. It's better, I believe, because of what common people are doing amongst themselves, saying, no, we want to be multicultural. But you look at the radio stations and you look at the BBC and you look at all the channels, who they commission shows from and why they do it. Actors, music, pop music particularly. It's very hard to get a band started these days if you're working class, for example. It's mostly middle class people, many of them public school educated in the acting profession particularly, who are still dominating it. So will there ever be a black prime minister? Certainly not one that really is a believer in a multicultural country. That's what my view is. You might get Braverman in there, or I mean, we've had Sunak, but he was basically promoting the same story as everybody else. Sorry for sounding a bit depressing.
Yes, Phil. I'm going to bring David in now. Is it Iqbal? Can I bring David in, and then you can come back and have the last word, as it were?
Absolutely, yes.
I'm going to bring David in now.
Okay. I was just going to say the connection between the rise of the far right, racism and nationalism. I mean, I think going back to somebody mentioned Brexit. I mean, I think Brexit was largely an English nationalist movement or English nationalist sentiment, and UKIP and Nigel Farage and now Reform, who are setting the agenda, who both the Labour and Tory are both responding to the agenda that's been set by Farage and Reform. And it's an English nationalist agenda, although nobody actually terms it in those terms, but I think it is essentially. And the field is wide open to the right to exploit English nationalist sentiment from a reactionary point of view, because the left won't touch anything to do with England or the concept or the construct of English, because they just, we're not English, we're internationalists, we can't be English, we're not nationalists. But it just leaves the field wide open to the right, and Reform and Farage and Starmer and Badenoch are all going to exploit that to their advantage. So I'm maybe repeating myself, but I mean, I'm in despair as the left, apart from Steve and Steve's failing attempts over the years to try and create an English left response, an English left, I don't know even what to call it, but somehow to take on England as a concept without being ashamed of it or embarrassed of it. It's just a fact of life that the country we live in is England. It's not something to be ashamed of and embarrassed about, and to actually take on the right in the geographic region that we live in, which is England. And there's a lot more I could say, but I'll shush for now.
Thank you very much, David. That's what I was going to ask Iqbal as we draw the meeting to a close. That was what I was going to ask Iqbal about. How can we reclaim Englishness? That it's not this ridiculous idea of the little Englanders who all seem to have gone to Frinton-on-Sea and are barricading themselves in there, perpetuating the myth that never was. So that's what I'd like to come back to you now and ask you, how do you think we can reclaim Englishness from the right wing and make it left and make it us, the people?
Gosh, that's a really good question. And David's absolutely right as well, that we do need to reclaim it from the right. How we do it, that's such a good question. I don't know. I've never actively thought about it, but I think you need involvement from all the communities. And I think at like a very basic level, it would be like questionnaires or spoken questions in community groups. What does it mean for you to be English? Excuse me. What does it mean for you to be English? What do you think of when you think of the term England, English? And I think you've just got to bring people together. I think it's the togetherness that is missing, because at the minute, I'm sure a lot of people do think it's that twee, village green, dancing around the maypole. These bizarre images from the past that, as Mike said, I think that it's never really existed. These are things that are brought out. Almost the opposite of a boogeyman. It's the opposite thing. It's like, look what we used to be like, and look what we are now. But we were never like that. These are images that are perpetuated. So I think we need to perpetuate different images. I think we need different voices. Definitely the politicians need to reclaim this in some way, where it isn't linked to things, where it isn't linked to a lazy link like the flag or anything. That can't be part of the Englishness. Englishness is more about values and qualities. And we talk about English values. We need to just look at those values, and there can't be things like, silly things I've heard people say, but the English go to the pub all the time. But these are divisive things again, because many cultures don't drink, so they can't go to the pub. So we mustn't find the things that divide us. We've got to find the things that unite us. And I think a discussion needs to happen up and down the country, right from school level all the way up to politicians, as to how do we make all of us feel more English, and what does it mean to be English. But I think many discussions are needed at that community level, in the house, in schools. So maybe it's added on to some kind of GCSE, where they look at community and sociology or psychology, something like this. At some very deep level, I think we all need to have that discussion, but everyone needs to be included in that discussion. It can't just come from the politicians, or it can't come from people who are obviously white, because again, then it's like they are dictating what Englishness means. We need to get away from all of that. In the way that if you ask somebody from the right what it meant to be English, and I'm sure they would have some very obvious examples that they would bring up, and I'm not saying that those examples are correct, but in their heads, they would have absolutely no doubt as to what it would mean for somebody to be English. And for them, it would come down to silly things like skin colour and going to the pub and believing in this and the Union Jack and all these very tangible things that to them make sense. We need to find similar tangible things that make sense to everybody else. And yeah, it's about uniting, it's about having conversations. But off the top of my head, I'm not sure what it means. But I always think Englishness and this country is very inclusive. I think it's very kind in general. And I think in general, we're very open and very open-minded. You're always going to have people who are not. That will happen in any community. Utopia doesn't exist. but I do think we need to have conversations about it. And even though that might not seem very important when everything else seems to be going wrong, I think to some level it is important because we need to heal the fractures, we need to unite people, we need to bring communities together. And when we see examples of that, or when communities come together, often in the wake of some horrible event that's happened, that's really lovely, it's really encouraging, but we mustn't wait for the horrible events to happen. We must find a way to have these discussions now, really, all the time. And just to make people of all backgrounds who live in this country, whether or not they think they are English or not, we need them to feel more comfortable being here. And one way is just to have a very simple list of definitions and values that we think this is what it means to embody Englishness. So yeah, conversations, I think, first of all.
Thank you very much indeed, Iqbal. That was a lovely summary. And I think that's where we are, exactly as you've described. So I want to thank you so much for coming and talking to us. It's been lovely. It's been lovely hearing your experiences and seeing your optimism about the future. It's been really lovely. So I want to thank you very much for coming tonight. I want to thank everyone else for coming tonight. It's been a really special meeting. Thank you very much, Iqbal, and to everyone else. Enjoy the rest of your evening.
So much for having me, guys. Take care. Bye-bye.